Hello, and welcome to WorldCanvass from International Programs at the University of Iowa. This is part 2 of a 4-part series on a century of film in the public sphere. My guests for this program tonight are Julia Haslett, visiting associate professor and head of film and video production in the University of Iowa Department of Cinema and Comparative Literature. And Julia is right next to me here. Hi, Julia.
Hi.
Thanks. And Jessie McLean is next to her, and Jessie is an assistant professor also in the Department of Cinema and Comparative Literature here at the University of Iowa. So, Julia and Jessie, we began this series by surveying the evolution of film, kind of development of film as an artistic enterprise, and sort of financial and industry effort as well. And obviously, this filmmaking has reinvented itself many times over during these last 100 years or so. You are both filmmakers and also both teach here. Teach other young, aspiring filmmakers. So let me ask each of you to tell us what grabbed you first about film that made you feel that this should be your life's passion or the field you wanted to pursue. I'll start with you, Julia.
Okay. My interest, I'm a documentary filmmaker, and my interest in film, I wasn't able to study film in college, so I was an English major. But not long after I left college, I was thinking about what was it that I wanted to do with my life that would be meaningful. And I was very interested in politics, and I was interested in the visual world, and I had been a painter, as much as, in high school and taken painting classes in college. And so I was interested in something that would combine those two dual interests. And documentary film kind of entered my head, not that I hadn't seen any films before, but it sort of merged those two interests. And so I went to a local community access television station in the town where I was living at the time and started learning how to make videos. And so it was that dual interest, and then, have been continuing to work in that vein in different capacities ever since.
Very cool. That's good to know that for anybody who might be watching this program and they're thinking, oh, I blew it. I didn't take film classes in college. I'll never be able to do this sort of thing. They actually have other opportunities to learn the craft. So the big thing there is to have the idea and the drive.
Yeah, I think, it's a difficult road, or it can be. Documentary filmmaking in particular is not a very lucrative enterprise. So I think, a commitment to the subjects, to the people that you're documenting, to a commitment to making work available and communicating, and like both Steve's up here before were talking about, that engaging with an audience and engaging on significant issues of our time and having those opportunities to instigate dialogue.
Well, I'll ask both of you this next question. I'll just throw it out there if you can think about it. But so are you trying to have everyone take on your point of view? If you're producing a documentary that, for example, has there's a real point you're trying to make as a filmmaker, and I know that there are documentaries where you're not necessarily trying to be persuasive, but you're just going after something else. But if you are trying to be persuasive, how do you do that, and how can you feel? Are there things you want to be careful of when you're trying to make a persuasive argument on film? But Jessie, let me go to you and to ask you how you got started in film.
Well, my story is similar to Julia's in that I didn't study film in undergraduate. I studied art, and I came to film through art. Initially, I wanted to be an animator, and I would consider myself an experimental filmmaker. So I don't know. I got interested in filmmaking in college. I took one class because I studied at NYU for a semester, and that's when I really decided that maybe this was something I wanted to do. But I never pictured myself working in Hollywood or in a conventional system. I thought I would be an independent filmmaker, and like Julia, after school, I started taking classes at a media arts center in Pittsburgh, which is where I'm from. And discovered that I didn't really like making films in that model, even in an independent way. It just wasn't for me. But I found a community of people that were interested in cinema, and it's more of a fringe element, I would say, that identifies experimental cinema or avant-garde cinema or just very expanded cinematic forms. And that was where I felt like I developed as an artist, because it allowed me to blend a lot of interests. Similar to Julia, appreciate being able to bring up many interests into the cinematic process and talk about lots of ideas within it. But for me, it's also formal. There's just the abilities of working in really different ways and the material in ways that are very unconventional.
So help me understand what you mean when you say an experimental filmmaker.
That term is a difficult term. And a lot of experimental filmmakers don't like it, actually, because it seems like what they're doing is always a guessing game. But it's just a name that's kind of stuck. There tend to be 4 classifications of film: narrative, animation, documentary, and experimental. And they're all problematic, and they blend. And most of us, if not all of us, in the Department of Cinema and Comparative Literature are into more fluidity between these classifications. But just for the purpose of a discussion, it makes it easier to be able to say, I'm a documentarian, or I work in narrative. So experimental, a lot of times the work is more short form, maybe more materialist, thinking about it more abstract, or combining collages and methodologies. I mean, really anything could go, but a lot of times that work finds a home in museums or places that would experience art versus the Sycamore Theater.
Right. Well, so let me come back to this question about maybe a provocative topic and a filmmaker, a documentarian, perhaps wanting to really change hearts and minds and open people's eyes to something that they think they may not be seeing.
Well, I suppose the best name that comes to mind would be Michael Moore, right? So someone who's working in a kind of performative capacity as a filmmaker, using his own background, character, presence on camera to investigate and muckrake, and bring attention to a range of controversial topics. And in his approach, I mean, it's fairly unapologetic. His politics are quite explicit in his methods and transparent. And so, I mean, he would be one who I would say is very effective at what he's doing, but is maybe not quite so open in terms of his formal use of the medium, because it's like, it is more propagandistic, right?
Yeah, right.
And he has a very clear goal in terms of, bringing attention to things, but it's not it's not experimental, but it's not necessarily interested in these larger formal questions that Jesse's referring to.
Yeah.
So that would be the most.
Tell us about a film you've made.
Well, the most recent one that I've completed is a film called An Encounter with Simone Weil, which is about a French philosopher and labor activist turned mystic in the 1930s in France. But it's also a personal essay film, so it's about her ideas about how we respond to human suffering and how those ideas resonate with current politics in this country and abroad, and also relates to some questions in terms of my own family history, and my own relationship with that question of how do we respond to seeing people in pain. And so that film is a sort of feature-length documentary personal essay film. And it's a film that raises a lot of diverse questions, and so it's screened in a lot of different contexts, from film festivals to universities to places of worship, and it really asks people to consider how they pay attention, how they attend to people in their lives and in larger political issues, and what they may or may not be able to do to address them.
Yeah. So you mentioned that this relates in some very direct way to questions you've had in your own life, family life, and so on. Do you find that working through the film process helps you come to some better resolution or understanding of?
Certainly in this film, it did. I mean, this is the most personal film that I've made. And so definitely, it was a film that took me 6 years to make, and so there's a lot that happens in 6 years, and there's a lot of working through any number of things, whether it be formal elements, formal issues that you're trying to resolve. The film was about a woman for whom I could find no moving images of her. So that was sort of part of that journey in trying to respond to some of the formal challenges that I faced. And in terms of, I was the editor of the film. Editing is my favorite part of filmmaking. It was also cheaper than hiring an editor. So I was the editor and the director. And so in as much as I was doing a lot of the editing, I was really in there with those decisions in sort of real time and redoing them and rethinking them and, you know, the sort of iterative process. So that is definitely one that I think leads to a deeper understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Personally, it would seem to me that it would take a lot of great powers of release to be the film, maybe the film's screenwriter and also the director, but then to turn over the editing process to someone else, however trusted that editor is, because it is so much your baby, and then to have someone else make some of those calls on what stays in and what goes out, I think would be kind of tough.
Yeah, I mean, I worked on that film with a consulting editor, so there was, but I was sort of doing the nuts and bolts,
Yeah.
and he would come in from time to time and review it. I have worked with editors in the past, and I think it depends on one's relationship to the piece. I mean, the more personal, on one hand, you could argue it's better to have some totally objective third party looking at the material if it's a personal piece, but on the other hand, it feels very odd to have someone else doing that work for you. So, I mean, I you know, obviously, the role of the editor is a very critical one, and I'm teaching in class this semester here, and, you know, just the importance of having someone who wasn't on set, who wasn't committed, or didn't suffer and sweat over getting a specific shot, or right, and having someone who's dispassionately in the editing room, and maybe you didn't get the shot, so, or that scene doesn't work, or it needs to be 2 minutes and not 5 minutes, or whatever. So it's a very important role. And obviously, I think there's a reason why a lot of filmmakers end up working with the same editors year after year, because it's a very an important and in a relationship that is, you know, needs to be very much based on trust and a sort of shared sensibility.
Yeah, do you work with a team, with a whole crew that you have worked with over time?
No. But I'm much more open to feedback, and I depend on that. So I need have a sort of trusted group of friends and peers, and, you know, sometimes widen the net to a bigger audience when I'm working on a project, and their input is essential, because it's so easy to lose your critical distance when you're working on something. And as Julia mentioned, even when it took you so long to either get that shot or animate that sequence, or it was so difficult that day and you really need to use it because everyone was in the freezing rain for 10 hours, so how would they feel if you didn't use the shot? All these kinds of things become very difficult to navigate. So you need, I think most artwork in film, of course, becomes better with the input of other people. Not everyone shares this belief, but I know from my own practice that once I started involving others in the process of evaluating the work, and look, they're not evaluating it in terms of it's good or it's bad, but just, is this working? Am I getting across what I'm trying to say, or are people getting confused? And I would be lost without that, I think, or it would get too solipsistic. I would just become my vision. And, I mean, there's a lot of ideas that get generated in the creative process, and most of them are not great. So you have to find your way through that and the assistance of other people, and the additional voices. You learn a lot through that process. You get ideas that you wouldn't have generated on your own, and that's invaluable. So I don't collaborate with anyone in terms of, you're going to do my sound design or you're going to do my edit, but in that way it's collaborative. And I have collaborated in the beginning of my film career. I was very hesitant to do my own sound design, so I would just sort of say, give it to someone else to score it or whatever. But now I can't imagine giving that control away. So I think it's an interesting exercise, because I also think it can be good to not be too controlling and share in that process. And I don't know. There can be, when you are funding your own projects or something like that, you can want to do every role yourself. So I think it says something when you want to share with another person, allow their input. Or
what kinds of themes interest you? What are the sorts of things you're thinking about that might turn into a film project?
Well, right now I'm thinking about the kind of flood of digital information as part of our life, and how we deal with it, and how it's affecting our mental and interior states, but also our landscape. And thinking a lot about data storage centers, and how there's this They're kind of the physical evidence of something that we don't want to think about because we want to think of the internet as this non-material place that has no presence, but really there is physicality to it. There are energy that's being utilized, a huge amount of energy, and these sites are extremely interesting to me because they're almost like black sites. You're not allowed to know where they are, you're not allowed to visit them. So yeah, that's an interest to me, thinking about that, the relationship we have to this kind of influx of just ideas and material and how it's changed our behavior. I'm of the age to have experienced life prior to the internet and life fully within it, so I think about that a lot, about what I used to do with my time. I mean, these are very popular themes, but I think they're very relevant. That's something I'm working on right now.
So with documentary films or experimental films, it's likely or it's possible that they won't be seen by masses of people unless you might be on maybe picked up by PBS or one of the television services that shows slightly more specialized films like this. Does that bother you? Or, I mean, it doesn't, you don't at the end of the day say, oh, if I could just do a Hollywood film, you know?
No, that I definitely don't feel. No. I mean, I think that you know, the audiences for documentary obviously shift, and I think the internet and the availability of being able to stream digital content, I think, has helped all film, you know, and video have a broader audience, which I think is exciting. It's not a collective necessarily experience as much anymore, but it's still an experience of viewing. So, I mean, I feel, you know, I mean, maybe this is a little cliche, but I feel if one person, you know, has an insight or has some kind of, or moved in some way, I mean, obviously, if it's my mother, maybe that would feel a little restricting, if that was the only audience member. But you know, I mean, clearly, as much as I'm making films that do engage with larger political and social issues, the point is that the audience exists and that it can be built in different ways and in creative ways. And I think that there are a lot of possibilities in terms of post-screening dialogues and conversations that can go on, especially with documentary work, that, you know, whether there's, I mean, often, you know, when you have too many people, that's not possible, right? Conversation is most meaningful, and I think if there are more than 3 people, it's mostly ceases to be meaningful. So, that being the case, I think that, yeah, I mean, I don't have the, I mean, the biggest issue there, obviously, is a financial one, right? So the smaller your audience, the less money is at stake, and so as the maker, you're having to figure out other ways to survive.
Yeah, and filmmakers who are doing films like yours, are usually self-funded, or you get grants from, I don't know, the NEA, or?
I mean, there's a certain amount of, yeah, I mean, I raised funds from philanthropic organizations or foundations or that sort of thing. There are also, you know, I mean, a lot of people who are working in experimental or nonfiction forms work in universities and, you know, are in relationship to other artists and intellectuals and are teachers, and that helps support their craft. There's a subset of wealthy people who have money to underwrite their films. So there's kind of a range.
And you said that many of your films might be more likely to be shown in, say, an art museum or some kind of creative space than Sycamore Mall. Do you expect that they would show up on a public television service or on a you know, I don't know, a Bravo or one of these kinds of things, or no?
I think that maybe, but I think that has a lot to do with the fact that I mostly make shorts, and there's just not a lot of programming for shorts. I mean, there are.
Why isn't there? Because there are so many good shorts. Sometimes if you go to a festival of short features, they're just wonderful. Why is there no good outlet for those that is easily reachable by, you know, a big audience, even in their own homes?
I mean, I think things have changed so much because of the internet, and people can access a lot of work that you could never access before. And also they're watching things that are short. I mean, even in more conventional means, just television shows that are 8 minutes long or 3 minutes long. I mean, you might, not you, but the collective, you might grumble about attention span, but this is pretty different because we were very programmed to, a television show is 25 minutes long, or an hour, or a movie is 70 minutes to 100, or whatever the range is. That has a lot to do with things that are beyond my scope, that have to do with probably commercial and marketability. And if you came out and said, I have a 48-minute feature, and tried to get a distributor, they would say, well, that's not really going to work.
Yeah.
It has to be about 60 minutes. I mean, Julia would know a lot about this, or a lot more about this than I would, because she's actually made a feature. And I think that is a very complicated world, though, the world of just the expectations for a feature and things like that.
So how do you, using the internet, how do people find your films? Is it just kind of word of mouth, or are there sharing sites where you can put your things?
Well, I mean, usually with the kinds of films that we're making, they tend to first appear in film festivals, right? So that's more of a theater-based viewing experience. And then, depending on the film, I mean, my film is just recently now available on iTunes and Amazon and all of that, but that was quite recent. It had for about a year or so, it was only available at university libraries in terms of the DVD form, and then on television in Europe. So, I mean, I think what's exciting about the internet and digital technology is the capacity for individual artists to promote and put their work up there and make it available, and give someone a URL, is enormously exciting. And so really anyone, any student, can post their work.
Yeah. So you're teaching students. What are the students you're working with, doing with film? What are they most inspired by? What do they talk to you about that they want to make or that they're currently working on?
I mean, I think most of the students that I encounter initially are very interested in narrative. That seems to be what they've had the most experience with, because again, even though we have much more access to more expanded forms of documentary or narrative or experimental cinema, it's still not in the mainstream. You have to seek it out. So I think most students tend to show up with an interest in narrative. But because of our program, I think that a lot of them get very interested in documentary, which is unusual for undergraduates, at least in my teaching experience. Previous school I taught at, students were not as interested in documentary as they are here. I think that has a lot to do with the aims and the interests of this program. So, that's what I'm finding. I mean, there's a lot of horror movies that want to be made.
Yeah.
But beyond.
Yeah. What do you find?
I mean, I would concur with Jessie that, the majority of our undergraduate students, our graduate program is quite distinct, are interested in narrative and in fiction film, but there is an openness, and I think that's a testament to the nature of the program, where we're filmmakers working alongside film scholars, and so the students are getting a very good training in how to look at and analyze film and getting exposed to a lot of variety of films, which I think makes them much smarter makers. So, and there's an openness there. There's an openness to different forms and to experimenting, which is inspiring.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Julia Haslett and Jessie McLean. So happy that you would be here tonight to talk with us about A Century of Film. This is part 2 in a 4-part series, and I hope you can join us next week for part 3. And WorldCanvass programming is available on YouTube, iTunes, UITV, and the International Programs website, which is international.uiowa.edu. I'm Joan Kerr. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.